Hey everybody, I hope you had a good weekend. I know, not great, but I hope it was better than having to do schoolwork all week. I'm ready to read to you chapter 6, and this chapter is called Spoiled Potatoes. There's actually quite a few pictures in this chapter, so that's kind of nice. So it's a little bit longer of a chapter than we've been having, but not too bad. All right. Day after day, the two gold ships beat their way north along the ragged coast of Chile. Black smoke boiled up from their funnels, and and headwinds spun it out into long streamers. Jack just sat on a keg, and Praiseworthy stood over him with a pair of scissors. The boy's hair had shot up like a broom straw during the long passage through the strait, and Praiseworthy had no intention of letting it grow any longer. "Now hold still, Master Jack," he said. "I am holding still," said Jack, "as still as I can on a boat." Praiseworthy snipped away. "You'll be a young man before your Aunt Arabella sees you again. She may not forgive me. You're getting your height like a sapling." "Praiseworthy," said Jack, "do you really think we'll strike it rich in California?" "No doubt about it," he said. The wind carried the snips of yellow hair off into the wind, and maybe all the gold nuggets will be dug up before we even get there, though. "Nonsense. There'll be enough for everyone going." But in the privacy of his thoughts, Praiseworthy didn't believe that for one moment that they would be stubbing their toes on lumps of gold. Still, he must see to it that the young Master Jack did indeed strike it rich. It would not be to return to Boston without a sack or two of treasure to help Aunt Arabella. Why, some of the passengers had brought along chests and boxes to be filled with nuggets and gold dust. As Praiseworthy clipped away, passengers stood around watching and offering advice. Even a haircut broke the monotony of the endless days at sea. So here's a picture as I read the next page. Needs a little bit more of a snip on this port side," said Dr. Buckbee, who had thrown away his alarm trumpet and regained his good humor. "Nah," said Mountain Jim. "Work them shears along the starboard beam there, Praiseworthy. That's where it wants evening up a mite." A shout from the lookout drew everyone's attention to the Sea Raven's stern. "She stopped making smoke, Captain," someone yelled. Smoke had indeed stopped billowing from her funnel, and Captain Swain came out on deck and gave the ship a squint. "Her coal bunkers are empty," he said. "She went around the Horn, and we saved fuel slipping through the strait. But we're not much better shape ourselves, gentlemen. If this wind doesn't turn around, we'll be burning our last lump of coal soon enough." By the end of the day, the Sea Raven slipped entirely from the view of the horizon, and Praiseworthy took no comfort from the Lady Wilma's lead. "It's the end of the race that counts," he said again and again. The wind didn't turn around, and it died away completely. The Lady Wilma was able to keep steam up in her boiler for almost a week. One day grew warmer than the next, and soon the gold seekers were pulling off those sweaters and coats again. Jack shucked off his shoes and took to climbing the ratlines and tarred hemp ladders stretched up into the mast tops. Wearing a stocking cap the first mate had given him, he would spend hours in the crow's nest, seeing the world go by. There were times when he felt that he could almost see California. The day came when the last shovelful of coal was scraped out of the bins, and the boiler fire burned out, and the merry thrash and throb of the side wheels ceased, and the Lady Wilma sat becalmed in the water. Day after day, the gold ship languished on the sea, waiting for a good wind to fill up her canvases. A week passed, and then two, and then fresh water in the tanks got dangerously low, and Captain Swain ordered it rationed out for drinking only. From the crow's nest, Jack looked down on the gold seekers, wandering the decks like caged men. One day, Praiseworthy came up the ratlines, bowler hat and umbrella and all, and they watched the whales pass the time. "Is Aunt Arabella an old maid?" Jack asked solemnly. "An old maid?" replied Praiseworthy. He leaned his chin on the hook of his umbrella. "Your Aunt Arabella is a young and very beautiful woman." "It is because of my sisters and me." "Is what because of your sisters and you?" "I mean, if she hadn't had to bring us up, maybe she would have gotten married a long time ago." The butler dismissed this thought. "Stuff and nonsense," he said to Master Jack. "Sarah once said it was all because of us." "Dear Miss Sarah is very mistaken. I have no doubt that your Aunt Arabella is mainly waiting for the right gentleman to come along. and I dare say he'll be delighted to find 2 nieces and a stalwart young nephew in tow. Constance and Aunt Arabella Constance said Aunt Arabella was in love once, but he died and she never got over it. Dear Miss Constance is mistaken also, I am sure, said Praiseworthy. No, let's not have any more talk of this. Look, there, aren't those sharks in the water? Sharks they were, and Mountain Jim, who was fishing, caught one of them. He called for the cook, and Mr. Azaria Jones gasped. You're not going to eat that thing, are you? He said. I sure am, said Mountain Jim. If he had the chance, he'd eat me, wouldn't he? Another week passed, and Mr. Azaria Jones's 18 barrels of potatoes began to spoil in their barrels. I'm ruined, he wailed, pacing the hot decks. His heavy face hung slack underneath a large straw hat. Nonsense, said Praiseworthy, out for a stroll. But I'm a poor man, groaned the Yankee trader. I had every cent I own in those potatoes. I tell you, I am ruined. Then you must sell those potatoes, said the butler, who wished only to be of service. Sell spoiled potatoes? My good friend, it's clear that you know nothing about potatoes. Not a thing. Who do you think's going to buy spoiled potatoes? I haven't the faintest idea, said Praiseworthy, but that's only because I haven't given the matter any thought. It was a knotty problem, even for Praiseworthy. The next day, the French immigrant, Monsieur Gaunt, could be seen pacing the decks in one direction, while Mr. Azaria Jones paced the decks in the other direction. Mon Dieu, declared the Frenchman, I'm ruined. My grape cuttings are drying up, and the captain will not give me a drop of fresh water to keep them alive. I'm ruined, he cried. Then you must water them, said Praiseworthy. Water them? Exclaimed the Frenchman. Water them, you say? With what? Why, with water, said the butler. The Frenchman just shook his head. I have 50 gold pieces in my money belt, but 1,000 gold pieces will not buy me a drop of fresh water on this ship. Well, then we must find a way, said Praiseworthy. Fresh water and coal lay waiting 1,000 miles further north of the port of Calico on the coast of Peru. But the Lady Wilma seemed rooted to the spot, becalmed and motionless with no wind. All that day, Praiseworthy racked his brains. Fine men, Monsieur Gaunt and Mr. Azaria Jones, the butler told himself, and something must be done to help them. But if a stiff wind came up, the gold ship could hardly make port soon enough to save the grape cuttings. And not even in Calico could Praiseworthy suppose that he could find a buyer for 18 barrels of spoiled potatoes. Indeed, Master Jack, said Praiseworthy, I seem to be at a failure in my first attempt at both trade and agriculture. I suppose that we should, at the very least, reimburse Mr. Azaria Jones for the few raw potatoes that we helped ourselves to as the stowaways. Suddenly, Jack's eyebrows shot up. A thought bolted through him like lightning. He was unable to speak for a full 3 seconds. Praiseworthy, he exclaimed. That is it. That's what? You've got it. Got what? At that moment, Mr. Azaria Jones came pacing down the decks from one direction, while Monsieur Gaunt came pacing from the other. Jack quickly explained, and Praiseworthy's eyes lit up right away. Gentlemen, said the butler, holding up his umbrella, to stop the Yankee trader and the Frenchman. Master Jack here tells me that I have hit upon a marvelous notion. Why, it's so simple that a boy could have thought of it. What's this? Asked Mr. Azaria Jones, his hands clasped hopelessly behind his back. Monsieur Gaunt, said Praiseworthy, as your agricultural advisor, I suggest that you buy Mr. Azaria Jones's 18 barrels of potatoes. They're a bit spoiled, but they're a good bargain. Potatoes? Exclaimed the Frenchman. What? Don't make jokes, monsieur. It's no joke, I assure you, said Praiseworthy. Confound it, Praiseworthy, grumbled the Yankee trader. No one's going to buy me out of spoiled potatoes. Nonsense, said the butler. Spoiled potatoes may be, but juicy they still are. Master Jack can attest to that. Why, they're like fat raindrops in brown skins, and Monsieur Gaunt, you need only poke your each grape cutting into a plump potato. I dare say that they will stay alive all the way to Calico. The Frenchman and the Yankee trader stood facing each other in the sun with broad smiles that crept over their slack, gloomy faces. Well, I'll buy your potatoes, exclaimed Monsieur Gaunt. And I'll sell my potatoes, exclaimed Mr. Azaria Jones. I'm saved, said one. I'm saved, said the other. And the bargain they struck was on the spot. Jack remained silent, but stuck his hands in his pockets and felt very proud of himself for thinking of it. Why, if it hadn't been a stowaway, if he hadn't slacked of thirst with his potatoes in hand, why, some future hillside would be left without a new vineyard. Gentlemen, said Mr. Azaria Jones, beaming at Praiseworthy and Jack, you'll need a few tools in the goldfields. When we reach the port, I'm going to buy you the best pick and the best shovel that they have. On the contrary, said the Frenchman, it is I who will buy them the best pick and shovel in all of Peru. With that, Monsieur Gaunt hurried to the hold and busied himself with his jackknife. He cut holes in all the potatoes and slipped in a grape cutting like so many straws. The next morning, a wind from the south came up, and the Lady Wilma's canvases swelled out with great white billows. A happy shout went up from the ship as it began to move through the sea again. For days after that, Mr. Azaria Jones stopped anyone who would listen and say, "Remarkable pair, that Praiseworthy and Jack. Born traders, you know. Imagine finding a buyer for 18 barrels of spoiled potatoes." Snapping winds drove the gold ship into even warmer latitudes, and soon the Argonauts were down to shirt sleeves again, and with growing excitement took hold of them as they could smell the land in the air. Men began to trim their beards and wash their clothes, and Jack was taking on the aspect of a young sailor. The salt air and the wind had toughened his face, and his eyes narrowed and the look of distance in them. He wandered higher and higher into the riggings, exploring the mysterious lofts, the foot ropes and shrouds and blocks. More than once, the boatswain, a botman with a voice like a frog's, chased him down the ladders. But it was like trying to keep a boy out of a backyard tree. All he wanted to do was climb. And here he is climbing and looking for land. Hanging onto a yardam, Jack was the first to notice the white speck on the horizon behind the Lady Wilma. The speck grew into sails, and sails into a ship, and the ship turned out to be the Sea Raven. "She's gaining on us!" shouted Mountain Jim. By noon, the Sea Raven was alongside the Lady Wilma, skimming lightly over the seas, and the wind seemed to pick her up and carry her along, light as a feather. "Blast!" roared the captain. "And me half sunk in the water with building bricks! Bricks! I have a notion to dump all those bricks overboard." But by dusk, the Sea Raven was gone, beyond the horizon, and now far ahead of the Lady Wilma again. And that is the end of chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you're doing well. I hope to see some of you soon on Google Meet. Bye.